everyone. My name is Dr. Melissa Kroll. I am currently an EMS faculty at Washington University in St. Louis, and today I would like to talk to you a little bit more about human trafficking and the sex trade. Before we get started, I want you to close your eyes and picture what human trafficking looks like to you. Do you have what that looks like in your mind? Does the picture in your mind look like any one of these gentlemen? What about this girl? Does this girl look like the victim you had pictured? What about this girl? Or how about this young boy? What about this situation? Could this person be a victim of human trafficking? And what about these gentlemen? Or these children? In reality, all of these pictures could represent a victim of human trafficking. How accurate was the picture in your mind to the pictures I showed? Did any of the pictures surprise you? One of the reasons human trafficking has been able to grow so big and is so difficult to really understand is because it's a very diverse problem and can look very different in different areas. And that's why I think it's so important to learn more about this topic. We'll start by looking at the definition of human trafficking, looking at the scope of human trafficking, who's at risk, how to identify victims, and learn more about how to report human trafficking once we identify a victim. Let's start with the definition. What is human trafficking? This is word for word the legal document definition. It's the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act where such an act is induced by force, fraud, coercion, or in which the person induced to perform such an act is less than 18 years old. That less than 18 years old is very important. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. As you can see, the second part of the definition is very similar. It's still the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person, but instead of for commercial sex act, it's replaced with servitude, debt, bondage, or slavery. And what this boils down to is that there are three required elements for the definition of human trafficking. And those three elements include action, means, and purpose. This is kind of a menu, so you can take any action, any means, and any purpose, mix it up however you want, but as long as you have one item from each list, that counts as human trafficking. Now, I'm going to emphasize this again because it's a really important point that the exception to this rule is if you're a child. There is no such thing as a child prostitute. Those things do not exist. If you are 16 and you are selling sex or have sexual exploitation, do not pass go. That is considered human trafficking. So what that really means, what human trafficking truly is that it's modern day slavery. It's exploitation of a person. It includes sex trafficking, forced labor, and domestic servitude. It is common. It happens in every single U.S. state and every U.S. territory, and it can affect a lot of people, and has affected folks from every socioeconomic status and gender, nationality, and age. Now remember, any person under the age of 18 that is selling sex is by definition a human trafficking victim. So now that we know what human trafficking is, let's look at what human trafficking is not. Human trafficking is a crime committed against an individual. It does not require that victim to be moved or transported, and it occurs through force or coercion of a victim. Now remember that a victim may say, hey, I was willing to do this job the first time and now I'm not willing. Once that victim says, hey, I would rather not, but is forced to continue, that's when it transitions into becoming human trafficking. Human smuggling is a crime against a country, and it, by definition, requires the transport of that person across an international border. And often, individuals agree to be smuggled. Another concept that I think is very confusing is the difference between prostitution and sex trafficking. Prostitution is a business. It's where the prostitute gets the opportunity to keep 100% of the money earned. They also have control of who they are sleeping with. They're not being coerced. And again, they're over the age of 18. Sex trafficking, on the other hand, is when the individual may not have the choice of who they are sleeping with. They may not have the choice of how much money they get to keep. And again, if that person is under the age of 18, even if they say, I am willing to have sex with you for money, that's illegal. It's sex trafficking. So I actually met with a human trafficking victim. Her name is Rachel. And one of the reasons I want to tell you Rachel's story today is because it really opened up my eyes on where human trafficking is in America and how it can look very different than what I initially imagined. So Rachel actually probably looked a lot like this picture. She grew up in an upper middle class, mostly white neighborhood. Her dad was very successful, worked in a business, and was busy most days. Her mother would often drink and would be out partying. After school, she would go to a trusted neighbor. Now, this is a neighbor that all of the kids kind of went to after school. He was older, he was respected, he was a member in the church. He was trusted. At the age of 6, Rachel was targeted for human trafficking. By the end of the year, she was being sold. At the end of 7, she was being sold as a match set with another girl who lived down the street from her. After school, Rachel would go to this trusted member's home and be sold for human trafficking. She would come home and be at home for dinner at 6. Rachel still went to school. She actually did very well academically, in part because school was her escape from life. Rachel's human trafficking experience ended at the age of 9 because her human trafficker moved away. It's not because we caught that person, and it's not because Rachel spoke up. It's because that trafficker moved. It's also true that Rachel still went to healthcare. She made it to all of her annual physicals. She went to the emergency department several times. And in fact, EMS was called to her house twice. So the question is how did we miss this? Why didn't we catch human trafficking for Rachel? And I guess one of the things I had a question of is, Rachel, why didn't you say anything? You know, if you would have just said, hey, this is going on, we could have done something. Now, Rachel's perpetrator used family to keep Rachel under control. Rachel had a twin brother, someone she was very close to. And the perpetrator in this story told Rachel, if you say anything to anyone, they'll take you away from your family. You'll never see your twin brother again. You won't be able to protect him anymore. And if you're gone, who's going to stop someone like me from getting to your younger brother? So I think that this was really eye-opening for me in a lot of different ways, because I sometimes think that we expect human trafficking victims to be chained in the basement, but in reality, many of these people still exist and live lives within the community. Now, Rachel was lucky. The unfortunate reality is that most victims do not escape from human trafficking. And in fact, less than 1% of human trafficking victims are rescued from their situation. And this has very real effects on a person's body. Human trafficking victims have a life expectancy of less than 7 years once they are trapped in human trafficking. Now, this can be secondary to illness and disease, but often this is secondary both to suicide and depression and the mental health effects that human trafficking has on the body, but can also be secondary to drug addictions that are secondary to their human trafficking situation. And when I think of slavery, I tend to think of the Civil War era slavery. But the sad truth of the matter is that even though slavery was abolished 150 years ago, there are more people in slavery today than at any other time in our history. And to show you a little bit more of the scope of the problem, let's look at some statistics. We know that in the United States today, each year between 100,000 and 300,000 children are sexually exploited. It's a $32 billion industry. Less than $100, or a girl is sold into a brothel for typically less than $100. 800,000 people are being trafficked each year. Girls as young as 5 have been known to be trafficked and sold into prostitution. The youngest victim on record is 6 months. 27 million people are enslaved worldwide today. And it's the second largest source of profits for international organized crime. And the average age of a victim in the United States is between the ages of 11 and 14. Doing those numbers, it is estimated that 1 out of every 236 people is a victim of human trafficking. Now, I don't know how many people are transported in your agency in a given year, but I would bet that it's more than 236 people, which means statistically, we see them. We see victims. And remember that the average age of the victims in the United States are 11 to 14. 50% of victims are children, not adults. And worldwide, it is estimated that a child is sold into slavery every 26 seconds. Taking a step back and looking at human trafficking on a more global perspective, we can see that this is a problem that affects every country in the world. And while I had mentioned earlier that human trafficking is not equal to human smuggling and does not require the transportation of humans, it can often include the transportation. If you look closer at this map, you can actually see that often there is an exportation of human victims to other countries. And these are not small numbers. If you look, Africa exports 50,000 human trafficking victims each year to help support the human trafficking needs of other countries. This movement of people is often done to try and isolate victims. It's difficult to escape your human trafficking situation when you have no familial support, you have no money, or at least no money of the currency of the country that you've been transported to, and if you don't speak the language of the country that you've been transported to. And the United States isn't free from this. We actually import between 14,000 and 17,000 human beings to meet our sex trafficking needs each year. So if human trafficking is so common, why don't we see it every day? And I think in part it's because we don't recognize what human trafficking victims look like. In America, we know that sex trafficking is by far the most common form of human trafficking. And that in part because of that, most of our human trafficking victims are female. 90% of victims are female. But I think we have to remember that a lot of human trafficking victims are younger than we would expect. Again, that average age is only 11 to 14. It can affect people of any ethnic origins, and in fact, the most common ethnic origin targeted in the United States is the Hispanic population. Just over half of human trafficking victims are U.S. citizens. About 40% are undocumented immigrants. Another thing that we have to keep in mind is that while victims may look different than what we anticipate, recruiters can look different than what we anticipate. When I think of a pimp, I think of the Hollywood purple velvet suit, leopard print hat, and a really large cane. But actually, when we look at it a little bit closer, 40% of recruiters are women. And in fact, when they looked at this a little bit closer, some of these recruiters are survivors of human trafficking themselves. Looking at human trafficking on a national scale, we can see that there are certain centers where human trafficking is most common. Taking a step back, we remember that human trafficking impacts every single state in the United States and occurs both in urban and rural areas. That being said, there are certain cities that are fairly notorious for the number of human trafficking cases that occur. And unfortunately, St. Louis is in the top 20 for these. St. Louis is in particularly part of the problem, partially because we have a lot of interstates and highways that go through the city. There is movement of human trafficking victims, sometimes in part to keep victims isolated. It's hard to reach out for help when you don't have any family or friends in a location. There are certain trends that we can see in the movement of human trafficking victims. Migrant workers tend to go from south to north, and sex workers tend to go east to west. The other problem that St. Louis has is that a lot of human trafficking victims are picked up from St. Louis, in part because we have a lot of crime and poverty in the city. And I will say that I've given this lecture multiple times now, and every time I give this lecture, I can always find a fairly recent news article discussing a human trafficking victim within St. Louis metropolitan area. Again, look at the age of the victim. This is unfortunately very typical of what we see in human trafficking. Looking at human trafficking on a global scale, we can see that there are many different types or styles of human trafficking. While commercial sex trafficking is common, forced labor trafficking is actually much more common globally. And again, forced labor trafficking can have a variety of different flavors about it. Most commonly, it's domestic servitude, but it can include hotel and hospitality work, child and elderly care, or forced labor and construction. As we had just seen on the previous slide, labor trafficking is much more common than sex trafficking. That being said, in the United States and most other more developed countries, sex trafficking is much more common than labor trafficking. This increase in sex trafficking in more developed countries contributes to the profits made and contributes to the fact that more money tends to be made by sex trafficking compared to labor trafficking. Who is at risk for becoming a human trafficking victim? I think we have to look at this both from a global perspective, but also from a national perspective. Globally, children who are from war-torn countries are at higher risk. Some children are sold as slaves, secondary to parents not being able to feed the children. Children are more likely to work in sweatshops because there is less regulation protecting these children. In war-torn countries, there's a lot of movement of populations. It's easier for children to become separated from parents, and it is much more likely that these children become orphans. On a national level in the United States, there are different populations that are much more high risk. Orphans are a particular high risk category. It is estimated that between 70 and 85% of human trafficking victims come from the foster system. This is thought to be because there's limited social support and a lot of movement of these victims naturally. Runaways are also a very high risk pool. Runaways are often targeted within 48 hours of them running away from their home, and it is thought that 1 in 6 runaways ends up being a human trafficking victim. As you can imagine, runaways don't have access to housing, food, or clothing, and so they are at high risk to kind of get trapped in these schemes where someone offers them food and housing for the trade of either labor or sex. Coming from a broken home also increases your risk of becoming a human trafficking victim, particularly if there is sexual or physical abuse in these homes. You know, if you've been experiencing sexual abuse and physical abuse in your home from as far back as you remember, then that becomes your normal. You're more likely to kind of continue and find that type of behavior acceptable going forward. Communities that have much more poverty and much more community violence are in general more at risk than communities that have a little bit more wealth and a little bit more social support. And anyone who is looking for acceptance, so that can include members of the LGBT community, and those kind of folks are much more susceptible to schemes where there's someone online saying, hey, no one in your home and no one in your school understands you, no one accepts you, why don't you fly across country and join me? I love you, I understand you. From an international kind of crossing border perspective, we have kind of a high risk population with the Hispanics, mostly because we border Mexico, and a lot of immigrants, whether they come through either legal or illegal means, come up looking for either better lives and better jobs, and so that they are often targeted and can get trapped in these situations where they are offered, money or a job at a much higher price, and then get involved in debt, bondage, and labor trade. So how are people recruited? How do they fall into human trafficking? Some people are recruited by force, by kidnapping, physical and mental abuse, but actually it's a smaller proportion than we would think. Sometimes it's people who are in their schools. It could be someone who promises them a nicer home. For runaways, it might be just a place to sleep at night. It could be for particularly labor trafficking, it could be the potential to make more money at a job. Or it could be promises of love. I mean, there was a very similar recent story about how there was a teenage girl who was going to get on a plane to fly across country to meet her online boyfriend. And it turned out that when she got there, it wasn't a boyfriend at all. It was a human trafficker who was going to keep her and sell her for sex. And again, some of these other promises aren't by force at all. It's not, hey, we promised you something and then we locked you into a basement. A lot of times it's this subtle trade that goes on. For children who run away, what typically happens is there's a very nice person who says, hey, you look lost and alone. why don't you stay in the house? After a week of staying in this house, getting fed, getting clothes, the person who owns the home may say, well, we really like having you here. We really want to continue to allow you to live here, but this house has expenses and you have to contribute to the expenses. One of the ways that you could help us pay this is by sleeping with my friend so and so. And that's often how human trafficking gets started, particularly among runaways and children. Why doesn't anyone leave? Again, a small proportion of these victims are kept in captivity and confinement, but more often it's threats of violence or violence. It could be shame and self-blame. Hey, you can't go back home. They'll find out what you did and all the people you slept with. It could be debt bondage. You are free to leave as soon as you pay off your debt, but then the amount that you get paid is so much less than your living expenses. There could be a lack of awareness of rights and resources. Again, many of these victims are children. They might not know that there are additional resources to help them get out of these situations. There might be additional locations and shelters that are there for them that don't require them to sleep around to pay for housing. Many victims have criminal records and drug addictions, and so part of that contributes to a fear of law enforcement and distrust of social services. It's not uncommon for us in the emergency department to have victims say, hey, I would like to get out. I've been a victim of human trafficking. And when we say, do you want to talk to the police? They say, absolutely not. Their fear of the police is greater than the fear of their pimp. And again, this part of the things that keep victims in a part of being trafficked is that there is all the power and control is held by the perpetrator. It can be economic abuse, threats, intimidation, isolation, minimizing of the victim. And if you look at this wheel of power and control, you'll notice in anyone who's had domestic abuse training that this is very similar to the types of strategies that are used to keep domestic abuse victims at home. And this can make it really hard for us. It makes it difficult for us to identify human trafficking victims. Victims often don't identify themselves as victims. They may not be locked up. And in fact, a lot of times they participate in normal activities. Another thing that is unfortunate is that many human trafficking victims first are sexually abused by family members, and sometimes are actually sold into abuse by family members. It makes it difficult for us as healthcare providers to identify someone as a human trafficking victim when they are with someone that I would trust. If the victim is with their mother, I don't know if I would suspect human trafficking. Children can be really much easier to control than adults. And another thing is that it can be difficult to tell the age of someone. It might be that there's a prostitute on the street who is asking for help for belly pain, and they look like they're 21, but in reality they're 16. Another example of human trafficking is Maria. So this is another story that was recently in the news. Maria actually came to the United States legally. She had her green card and she came to work as a nanny for a wealthy couple and their 2 kids. Once she came up to work as this nanny, they actually took control of her green card and then forced her to work long hours with very little pay. And when Maria tried to leave, they essentially said, you can't leave, I own your green card. As soon as you leave, you'll essentially be arrested and thrown into a prison by ICE. Now, Maria was actually kept in this situation for 6 years before she finally was able to escape. But it wasn't that they were necessarily locking her up, it was that they just controlled all of her documents. And she was afraid that if she went to the authorities, they wouldn't be able to find her green card and she would be perceived as an illegal immigrant. Do we interact with human trafficking victims? And the answer is yes. As we said earlier, that there are a lot of human trafficking victims that exist in the United States, and that human trafficking can have very real physical consequences. Interestingly, many of these seek medical attention. When reviewed in a study, over 90% of victims had seen a healthcare provider while being trafficked. And when we look at this even further, over 75% of them had seen a healthcare provider within the last 6 months. So not only are they seeing healthcare providers, they're seeing them relatively regularly. The most common place of healthcare interactions is the emergency department. And as we all know, that not insignificant of our emergency department population gets there through EMS. So how do we identify victims? We know we know that human trafficking is common. We know that we are probably seeing these victims. How do we identify them in our population? One of the things that can start to raise the red flags in our mind is the type of EMS calls. So calls for dehydration. We expect dehydration in elderly people who can't get up and get to their own water and young children. Again, people who can't access their own water. But if you see someone who's 20 years old or 30 years old who has repeated calls for dehydration, that should be unusual. They should be able to have access to their own food and water. Altercations should just raise red flags and awareness. Assaults, facial trauma. And again, we kind of think of human trafficking as sex trafficking, but there is a significant number of labor trafficking that exists in the United States. And so one of the ways that we see this is worksite injuries, particularly preventable injuries. If you see someone who fell off of a 20-foot tree and they weren't wearing any safety gear, that's unusual. We have safety standards in America. If those safety standards aren't really being met, that should raise awareness that this isn't really a good business setup and it could be a trafficking setup. The other thing I should mention is that each individual flag might not be that terrible of a thing, but it's the sum total of these flags. And so you might say, well, this is one little flag, but having little flags kind of add together, and it should just raise your awareness and your concern overall. There are certain drugs that are associated with human trafficking. Historically, this used to be barbiturates and benzodiazepines, in part because, one, they made victims compliant, but they also had this quote unquote added benefit of having deadly withdrawals. Now, benzos and barbiturates are much less common. More common now is more of the ecstasy opioid epidemic medications. Ecstasy again makes victims much more compliant and willing to perform at the bequest of their perpetrator. And oxycodone has a very miserable withdrawal. There are certain things that you may see in the home that may raise your concern and have red flags. And EMS is in a very special position because they are invited into the home, and it's not a location that people in the emergency department would have the opportunity to see. If you see a lot of opaque, boarded or barred windows, especially if it's in a location that you would not expect barred windows. External locks and interior doors. You wouldn't necessarily think that you would need an exterior lock for the bedroom down the hall. Lots of chains, bells, or tape marks on the doors. And again, these are just evidence of frequent restraints. Key doors in multiple locations. And then this disparate living quarters. If you see this fancy king-size bed in one room and then 6 people living all together in the next room, that should just raise a very large red flag in your mind. There are certain physical characteristics that should also raise red flags. This was something I didn't realize before I started learning more about human trafficking, but there are particular tattoos that are associated with human trafficking. This property of M. Fenton was actually a human trafficking tattoo. It was taken very literally. This person is literally property of M. Fenton. He branded his victims. The other kind of tattoo that should raise your awareness is any kind of barcode. Again, it's unfortunately not that uncommon to brand your victims. Any patient that appears much younger than stated age. Any person that has injuries consistent with non-accidental trauma. Lots of bruises that have various healing stages. If you're called repeatedly to the same location and it's always for UTI, home miscarriages, those types of things, starts to raise your flag. And then any evidence of medical neglect and malnutrition, particularly in kind of the 11-year-old to the 30-year-old range, because you would expect those people to be able to get out and get food if they were able to. Emotionally, there can be some emotional components to this. Victims may seem disoriented and confused. The classic way we think of this is they may appear coached on how to answer a common question. So for example, if you got called because they fell downstairs and you say, hey, what happened? The victim says, oh, I fell downstairs. That's an easy question. But if you ask a follow-up question like, what caused you to fall down those stairs? If they hadn't been coached how to answer that particular question, they may seem very vague. They may not answer it right away. They may look up at their perpetrator for the answer. For kids, again, because many of our victims are kids, they can start to have signs of withdrawing from normal activities. So 13-year-old kids have interests or hobbies or something that they're doing. If they have none of those things, that's a little bit weird. Something is going on. Either they're depressed or withdrawing for some reason. And always beware the friend. If this quote unquote friend is answering all the questions for the victim, if the victim is very submissive. Again, some of these victims don't necessarily speak English. It could be a recent immigrant, a Hispanic immigrant, or a recent immigrant from another country where they don't speak English, and this friend may insist on being the translator. Sometimes what we see is the friend is not very interested in the medical needs, or they may actually physically hold the victim's license, the victim's green card, the victim's passport. We have seen it before where we had a victim that was injured on the work site where he had gotten a very large cut or laceration to his face, and the friend who was with the victim kept asking questions about when can he go back to work. And I remember thinking very specifically, we'll try and save this guy's eyeball and his face. I don't know when he's going to go back to work. Those kind of interactions, when they occur, they should raise red flags because they're weird. What kind of red flags do we see in this picture? We can see that this person is underdressed for the weather. She doesn't have a coat. Other red flags that I didn't mention is if you're 14 years old and you have 3 cell phones and 2 pagers, that's weird. 14-year-olds should not have more than 1 cell phone, and no one uses pagers unless if you're on call essentially for medical facilities or if you're a human trafficking victim. What should you do? You say, look, I've had several red flags on this patient. I'm really concerned they may be a human trafficking victim. So if you're concerned, the best thing that we can do is speak to the patient alone. And we have an ideal opportunity to do that by just asking them to come into the back of the ambulance. You can ask the patient to turn off the phone during the transport. And remember, never put the victim's friend, quote unquote, or perpetrator in the back of the ambulance with you. Other things that we can do is use plain language, be at eye level, and avoid jargon. All of these things just make it easier for us to communicate to the victim. Ask permission before touching the patient. These patients are not used to having anyone value them. They're not used to anyone asking their permission. And so we want to establish that we're not going to try and startle them. We're not going to try and do anything abrupt. We also want to kind of communicate to them that we're trustworthy. The message we should be sending to these victims is very simply that we are safe people. We are here to help. And if that's the only message that gets sent across to these victims, that is a win. That is well worth the time. The last thing that's really important is if you are suspicious that the person that you're transporting is a victim of human trafficking, please, please, please tell the hospital. The last thing that I want to do is, once I have received a patient, is to then take the friend who drove separately, hopefully, and say, oh, I have Miss So-and-so in room 13. Please, why don't I walk you back to her? We just want to avoid those types of situations. We want to treat them like a patient first, in the same way that if you came across the scene of, say, a gunshot wound or something like that, our first responsibility is to ensure our safety and ensure the safety of our patients. We're going to treat them with respect and we're going to provide treatment. That means there are some things that we should probably avoid. One of the things that we want to avoid is to use the words human trafficking, abuser, and perpetrator. And this seems a little counterintuitive, but a lot of these victims don't see themselves as human trafficking victims, and it's going to put them on the defensive. We need to try to avoid being judgmental. They may tell you a story that seems really weird and bizarre, but we're going to try and at least not show that on our face. We're never going to confront the suspected trafficker, in part because these traffickers can be dangerous and we don't want to put our own providers in danger. We're not going to question the patient in front of other people. And if that patient doesn't want to answer, we should let them not answer. Talking about certain incidents can trigger stress responses the patient may not be ready to report. And again, a lot of the time, human trafficking victims do not have control or say over very much in their life. Anything that we can do to give control back to that patient is a really good thing. We're going to avoid shouting sudden movements. We just don't want to startle people. So let's say we've identified someone who we think is at very high risk for being a victim of human trafficking. When do we report our human trafficking concerns, and how do we report these concerns? To start with, I want to be very clear about when we should report these concerns. For children, we are mandatory reporters, and so anytime that we have these concerns, we need to report them. For adults, adult human trafficking victims have a lot of inherent rights in the state of Missouri. So we approach human trafficking victims very similarly to how we would approach victims of domestic abuse. In the same way that if someone comes out to you and says, hey, I'm a victim of human trafficking, I would like additional help, that would be someone we could call a report on. But if the patient is not confessing or saying that they are a human trafficking victim and are not interested in additional resources, it is not something that we are forced to do. The other kind of when should we do this reporting is often asked, do we do this right away when we're on scene? Inherently, this seems like a good idea because the perpetrator, the bad guy is right in front of us, the victim is right in front of us, we can kind of take care of it all at the same time. But unfortunately, this isn't really the best idea. Again, remember, a lot of these victims are not used to having relationships of people that they can trust, and they are inherently distrustful of police and figures of authority, and that can include you. And the last thing we want to establish for these victims is that when you call 911, you also get police and you also get this investigation of your life. And we want to prevent this kind of association because we want victims to feel free to call 911. And kind of as I had mentioned earlier, the best message that we can present to these people is we are safe people, we are here to help. So if you are concerned about human trafficking, please do not report it on scene and please do not report it in front of the patient, especially if that patient is a child. It is better to go to the hospital, give your report to the hospital, and then when you're completing a report, take time to make your reporting at that time. For children, we actually have a children's division for the state of Missouri, and it is very important to call these people specifically. There is a task force team that is specifically trained in human trafficking that can really go into the community and try and get these children out productively. Again, kind of as we mentioned, some of the reasons that people end up in human trafficking is because they don't feel safe at home. And for a lot of these runaway kids, their biggest fear is to be returned back to the home that they were in. And so this Children's Division Task Force is really capable of dealing with those types of concerns. For adults, if you do have concerns, please contact, again, the Claiborne and Kavanaugh, depending on where your districts are. And again, it's just because they have been specifically trained and there's a specific task force to deal with those concerns. Finally, if you're really concerned about a patient and that patient says, hey, I don't want you to report, that's not something I'm interested in, another place that you can report to is the National Human Trafficking Hotline. The reason I really like this hotline is because they actually keep track of the information kind of on a national standpoint. And that is useful because if we can start to identify where human trafficking is most common, we can then start to send resources right into the community and right to where human trafficking is flourishing, and start to prevent the spread of human trafficking in these high-risk areas. There's this other thing that you can do. It's the Code Blue campaign. You can actually increase your education about this topic. I know that I'm giving a fantastic lecture right now, but if you have additional questions and would like to learn more, you can actually go to this Code Blue campaign. And as you can see, there's actually courses that you can take that are specific for first responders, and that will give you additional information and training. Now, I have given this lecture in the past, and people say, wow, that was a really depressing topic. But I think it's an important topic. And I think that one of the reasons I think it's so important is because I know that you guys can make a difference. In the St. Louis Children's Hospital, they implemented a program to screen for human trafficking, and they have identified several human trafficking victims. And more importantly, they've actually been able to get quite a few of those victims to get out of human trafficking. And that's really what we're doing today, is we want to create opportunities to get these human trafficking victims out of human trafficking situations and into much better situations and freedom. An overview of what we talked about today. Human trafficking is common, and it's in our communities. We are seeing this every day. The first step of being able to identify human trafficking is to take time to educate ourselves and others, and remember to treat the victim first. The first step is to provide health care, and always, always, always report your concerns to the hospital. Thank you so much for your time and attention today. I really appreciate it. I hope you learned a little bit about human trafficking, and I hope that you go out and you identify some human trafficking victims and that we're able to connect them to resources so we can get them to a better life. Thank you again.